Did you even finish high school? Richard Sterling laughed, looking around the room for approval. Because frankly, I'm not sure you have the intellectual capacity to be addressing scholars like us. The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every glass froze halfway to every mouth. Dr. David Washington stood perfectly still, his dark eyes focused on a white man who had just insulted him in front of Harvard University's biggest donors. The fancy ballroom, with its gold walls and crystal lights, suddenly felt ice cold. David had heard worse. Growing up poor in Detroit, he'd been called every name in the book. But this was different. This wasn't some street corner or school playground. This was Harvard. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be where intelligence mattered more than skin color. Richard Sterling was smiling now, pleased with himself. He was a tall man with silver hair and a face that had never known real struggle. His family had been rich for 3 generations. His great-grandfather built railroads. His grandfather owned steel mills. His father sat on Harvard's board. And Sterling? Sterling had bought his way through Harvard 40 years ago with Daddy's money and barely passed his classes. But he was white, and he was rich. And in his mind, that made him better than the black man standing in front of him. Richard, Sarah Mitchell, the department head, tried to laugh it off. Dr. Washington is our keynote speaker tonight. Perhaps we should. Oh, I'm sure he means well. Sterling waved his hand like he was shooing away a fly. But really, Sarah, when we're talking about academic excellence, shouldn't we have standards? I mean, look at him. David felt every eye in the room on him. Some faces showed shock. Others showed embarrassment. A few showed agreement with Sterling's words. But most just looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else but witnessing this moment. David's hand stayed calm at his sides, but his heart was racing. He thought about his mother, Rosa Washington, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school. She cleaned offices at night, served food during lunch, and took care of rich people's kids on weekends. She never got to go to high school herself, but she made sure her son would get every chance she never had. He thought about the tiny apartment where he'd done his homework by candlelight when the power got cut off, about the days he went to school hungry because there wasn't enough food, about the teachers who saw his potential and stayed after school to help him learn, about the scholarship that saved his life. He thought about the years of studying. Community college first, because that's all they could afford. Then Wayne State University in Detroit, where he worked in the cafeteria to pay for books. Then Princeton for his master's degree, where he was one of only 3 black students in his program. Finally, Oxford University in England for his PhD, where he wrote his dissertation on African language patterns in American speech. 7 languages. That's how many David spoke fluently. English, Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, Arabic, and Swahili. He'd learned each one because knowledge was power, and power was the only way to fight ignorance. 43 published papers. That's how many research articles he'd written for academic journals. Articles that professors around the world cited in their own work. Articles that changed how people understood language and culture. 15 years. That's how long he'd worked to get to this moment. 15 years of proving himself over and over again. 15 years of being the smartest person in rooms full of people who thought he didn't belong. And now this rich white man who'd never earned anything in his life was questioning whether David had finished high school. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. The worst part was the laughter that followed. 3 other men in Sterling's circle actually laughed. Like it was funny. Like David's intelligence was some kind of joke. Perhaps, Sterling continued, emboldened by the reaction, we could find someone more suitable for tonight's speech. Someone who can relate to our level of discourse. Dr. Michael Ross, an older professor who'd always been kind to David, stepped forward. Richard, I think you're out of line here. Dr. Washington has impressive credentials. Credentials? Sterling's eyebrows went up in mock surprise. From where? Some community college? Some affirmative action program. That was it. That was the moment David decided he'd had enough. Not just of Sterling, but of every person like him. Every person who looked at David's skin color and assumed he was less intelligent. Every person who thought money and family names mattered more than hard work and actual brains. David straightened his shoulders. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. Mr. Sterling. That's Mr. Sterling to you, the rich man corrected with a smirk. Mr. Sterling, David repeated, his voice getting stronger. You want to question my education? I'm simply saying that standards matter. And frankly, I'm not sure you meet ours. David nodded slowly. I see. Well then, perhaps you'd like to hear about my education. Sarah Mitchell sensed something big was about to happen. She tried to interrupt. David, maybe we should. But David held up his hand. He'd been quiet for too long. He'd been polite for too long. He'd been professional while people questioned his worth for too long. No, Sarah. Mr. Sterling wants to discuss intellectual capacity. He wants to talk about standards. David's eyes never left Sterling's face. I think that's an excellent idea. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in people's drinks. Everyone sensed that something was shifting. The comfortable order of things was about to be disturbed. Sterling, still confident, crossed his arms. Fine then. Enlighten us. David smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of a man who'd been underestimated his entire life and was finally ready to show exactly who he was. Oh, I intend to, Mr. Sterling. In fact, I think everyone here should understand exactly what kind of intellectual capacity they're dealing with. He walked toward the microphone at the front of the room. Each step was deliberate, measured. The crowd parted like water, following his movement. Ladies and gentlemen, David said as he reached the podium, his voice now carrying across the entire ballroom. Mr. Sterling has raised some interesting questions about education and standards. Questions that I think deserve a proper answer. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. Some curious, some worried, some excited to see what would happen next. So let me give you that answer, David continued. Let me show you exactly what happens when you question the wrong black man's education. What Dr. David Washington is about to unleash will shock everyone in that room. The microphone squealed slightly as David adjusted it, the sound cutting through the thick silence like a knife. Richard Sterling stood 30 feet away, arms still crossed, that smug smile still plastered on his face. He had no idea what was coming. You asked about my education, Mr. Sterling, David began, his voice steady and clear. So let me start at the beginning. He paused, looking out the crowd of Harvard's elite. Professors, donors, board members, all watching with growing tension. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. My mother, Rosa Washington, was a single mom with an 8th grade education. She worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table, cleaned offices at night, served lunch at a diner during the day, babysat rich kids on weekends. Sarah Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't polite, safe speech she'd expected. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the projects. When I was 7, the heat got shut off in the middle of winter because we couldn't pay the bill. My mom and I slept under every blanket we owned, and she told me that education was the only way out. Sterling's smile was starting to fade. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. So I studied every day, every night, by candlelight when the electricity got turned off, in the public library when it was too cold at home. My mom would walk me there after her lunch shift and pick me up before her night job. David's voice grew stronger with each word. When I was in 5th grade, my teacher, Mrs. Johnson, noticed I could pick up languages fast, real fast. She started staying after school to teach me Spanish from her old college books. He looked directly at Sterling. That's when I learned my second language, Mr. Sterling, in 5th grade. How many languages did you speak in 5th grade? Sterling's face was getting red, but David wasn't finished. By high school, I was fluent in Spanish and French. My grades were perfect. Every single class. Every single test. 4.0 GPA for 4 straight years. Dr. Ross, the older professor who defended David earlier, was nodding with growing amazement. He'd known David was smart, but he'd never heard this story. I got a full scholarship to community college, worked in the campus bookstore 20 hours a week to help my mom with rent. Graduated summa cum laude with a 4.0 GPA. Again, the room was dead silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Then Wayne State University. Full scholarship again. I worked in the cafeteria serving food to pay for my books. Added German and Mandarin Chinese to my language skills. Graduated top of my class. 4.0 GPA. Sterling was no longer smiling. His arms had dropped to his sides. Princeton University accepted me into their graduate program. Full funding. Teaching assistant position. Learned Arabic while I was there. Wrote my master's thesis on African linguistic influences in American English. My professors called it groundbreaking. David could see some people in the crowd starting to understand what was happening, starting to realize they were witnessing something special. Then Oxford University in England offered me a spot in their PhD program. Full scholarship. Again, that's where I learned Swahili and perfected my academic writing. Spent 4 years researching how African languages shape the way Americans speak English. He paused, letting that sink in. My dissertation was published by Cambridge University Press. It's been translated into 6 languages. Professors around the world use it in their classes. Sarah Mitchell's mouth was hanging open. She'd hired David based on his resume. But hearing his story told like this, in front of everyone, made her realize she'd been treating a genius like just another employee. Since then, I've published 43 peer-reviewed articles in academic journals. My research has been cited over 2,000 times by other scholars. I've given lectures at universities in 12 countries. David's eyes found Sterling in the crowd. The rich man looked like he wanted to disappear. I speak 7 languages fluently. English, Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, Arabic, and Swahili. I can read and write in all of them. I've translated documents for the United Nations. I've helped create language learning programs for refugees. The power in the room had completely shifted. David Washington, the man Sterling had insulted 5 minutes ago, was revealing himself to be one of the most accomplished people in the room. Harvard recruited me specifically for my expertise. They offered me tenure track immediately, which almost never happens. The department chair called my work revolutionary. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. So you asked if I finished high school, Mr. Sterling. The answer is yes. With honors. Then I finished community college. With honors. Then I finished Wayne State. With honors. Then I finished Princeton. With honors. Then I finished Oxford. With highest honors. The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that fancy ballroom. But now I have some questions for you, Mr. Sterling. The rich man's face had gone from red to pale white. He knew what was coming. You mentioned standards. You questioned my intellectual capacity. You seemed concerned about the level of discourse at Harvard. David smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was a smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. So, let's talk about your standards, Mr. Sterling. Let's discuss your intellectual capacity. Sterling tried to speak, but no words came out. You graduated from Harvard, didn't you? Class of 1983. Sterling nodded weakly. With a 2.1 GPA, barely above failing. Your professors noted in your records that you missed more classes than you attended. Your senior thesis was described as adequate at best, and showing minimal understanding of the subject matter. Gasps came from around the room. How did David know this? Oh, you're wondering how I know that? David's voice was getting stronger, more confident. Academic records from 40 years ago aren't usually public. But when you're being considered for a teaching position at a university, they do extensive background checks, including on major donors who might influence hiring decisions. Sterling looked like he was going to be sick. Your family donated $12 million the year you applied to Harvard. Interesting coincidence. Your SAT scores were below the minimum admission requirements. Another interesting coincidence. The crowd was starting to murmur. Whispered conversations were breaking out. But wait, there's more, David continued, his voice now carrying the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. Let's talk about your business career, Mr. Sterling. The one you built on your family's money. Sterling was backing away now, trying to edge toward the exit. Oh no, Mr. Sterling. Don't leave now. We're just getting to the good part. David looked out at the crowd. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sterling here likes to question other people's qualifications. But I think it's time we question his. Richard Sterling was trapped, 30 feet from the exit, surrounded by Harvard's most powerful people, all staring at him with growing curiosity and horror. Dr. David Washington stood at the microphone, like a judge delivering a verdict. Let me tell you about Mr. Sterling's business career, David continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. The career he's built on questioning other people's intelligence. Sterling's face was now completely white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Sterling Industries, your family's steel company. The one your great-grandfather built from nothing. The one your grandfather expanded across 3 states. The one your father grew into a national powerhouse. David paused for effect. The one you nearly destroyed in 5 years. The crowd leaned in. This was better than any soap opera. When you took over Sterling Industries in 1990, the company was worth $200 million. It employed over 3,000 people across 6 states. It was considered one of the most stable steel companies in America. Dr. Ross was taking notes on his napkin. Other professors were pulling out their phones, recording this historic takedown. But you had big ideas, didn't you, Mr. Sterling? You were going to show everyone how smart you really were. You were going to prove that a Harvard education, even a barely passed one, was worth something. Sterling tried to speak. Now wait just a minute. No, Mr. Sterling. You had your minute. Now it's my turn to talk. David's command of the room was absolute. When he spoke, everyone listened. Your first brilliant business decision was to close 3 factories and move production to cheaper overseas locations. You laid off 800 American workers 2 weeks before Christmas. Remember that? Some people in the crowd were shaking their heads in disgust. Your second brilliant decision was to invest $50 million in a new technology you didn't understand. Something about automated steel production that was supposed to revolutionize the industry. David smiled coldly, except the technology didn't work. The company you invested in was a scam. You lost every penny because you were too proud to hire experts to check it out first. Sterling was now visibly shaking. How do you know all this? Public records, Mr. Sterling. SEC filings. Bankruptcy court documents. Newspaper articles. It's amazing what you can learn when you actually know how to read and research. The insult hit its target. Sterling flinched like he'd been slapped. Your third brilliant decision was to borrow money against the company to cover your losses. $60 million at high interest rates. Money the company couldn't afford to pay back. David looked around the room. By 1995, Sterling Industries was losing money every month. Employee morale was at rock bottom. Customers were canceling contracts. Your stock price dropped from $42 a share to $3 a share. Sarah Mitchell was frantically taking notes. This was information that could affect university funding decisions. But the best part, the absolute best part, was what happened next. David's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. You blamed everyone else. The workers were lazy. The unions were greedy. The customers were unreasonable. The banks were unfair. Everyone was wrong except you. Sterling's hands were clenched into fists now. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, but I do. Because I read the lawsuit transcripts. The ones where your own board of directors sued you for mismanagement. Your own family members sued you, Mr. Sterling. Your own cousins and uncles took you to court to remove you from the company. The crowd gasped. Family lawsuits among the rich were always scandalous. And do you know what the judge said in his final ruling? I have it memorized. David cleared his throat and spoke in a formal judicial tone. Mr. Sterling has demonstrated a fundamental lack of business judgment, an inability to accept responsibility for his decisions, and a dangerous tendency to blame others for his own failures. Sterling looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. The court removed you from your position as CEO. Your own family bought out your shares for 10 cents on the dollar. They saved the company by undoing every single decision you'd made. David paused to let that sink in. Sterling Industries is still in business today, still successful, still employing thousands of people, but only because they got rid of you. The silence in the room was deafening. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a public execution. So let's recap, shall we? David's voice was now that of a teacher explaining a simple concept to slow students. You barely graduated from a university you bought your way into. You inherited a successful business and nearly destroyed it. You blamed everyone but yourself when things went wrong. And then you had the nerve to question my intellectual capacity? Sterling tried one last desperate attack. At least I'm not some affirmative action hire who... Stop right there. David's voice cut through Sterling's words like a sword. The authority in his voice was so complete that Sterling actually took a step backward. Let's talk about affirmative action, Mr. Sterling, because I think there's been some confusion in this room about what that term actually means. David stepped away from the microphone, walking closer to the crowd. His presence filled the space around him. Affirmative action is when someone gets opportunities they haven't earned based on factors other than merit. When someone gets special treatment because of who they are, not what they can do. He looked directly at Sterling. Like when a rich white boy with terrible grades gets into Harvard because his daddy donated money to the school. The crowd stirred. Some people were nodding in agreement. Like when that same rich white boy inherits a company worth $200 million, not because he's smart or hardworking, but because he happened to be born into the right family. David's voice was getting stronger, more passionate. Like when that same rich white boy gets invited to exclusive events, gets introduced to powerful people, gets treated with respect he hasn't earned, all because of his last name and his bank account. He turned to address the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see affirmative action in action, don't look at the black professor who earned 7 degrees and speaks 7 languages. Look at the white man who bought his way through school and inherited everything he has. The applause started slowly. 1 person clapping, then 2, then 5. Within seconds, half the room was applauding Dr. David Washington. Sterling was backing toward the exit again, but David wasn't finished with him. Oh, and Mr. Sterling? One more thing. Sterling stopped, trapped by the crowd and his own morbid curiosity. I mentioned that I can speak 7 languages. Would you like a demonstration? Dr. Washington is about to deliver his speech in multiple languages, proving his intellectual superiority in the most dramatic way possible. But what he reveals about Sterling's current financial situation will be the final nail in the coffin. Dr. David Washington stood in the center of the Harvard Faculty Club ballroom, surrounded by 200 of the most powerful people in academic America. Richard Sterling cowered near the back wall, trapped by the crowd and his own humiliation. But David wasn't finished. Not even close. Mr. Sterling questioned whether I have the intellectual capacity to address scholars, David said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. So let me address you as scholars should be addressed. In the language of education, intelligence, and truth. He straightened his jacket and walked back to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I present my keynote address, The Real Meaning of Academic Excellence. David began in perfect, crisp English, his voice resonating with authority. Academic excellence is not inherited. It is not purchased. It cannot be faked or borrowed or stolen. It is earned through dedication, sacrifice, and an unending commitment to truth. The crowd was mesmerized. This wasn't just a speech anymore. This was a masterclass in public speaking. But perhaps some of you don't speak English as your first language. David continued with a slight smile. So let me repeat that sentiment in Spanish. Without missing a beat, he switched languages. His Spanish is perfect as his English. La excelencia académica no es hereda. No es puede comprar. No es puede finger. Pedir prestado o robar. Se gana traves a la dedication. El sacrificio y un compromiso infinito con la verdad. Gasps came from around the room. Several professors who spoke Spanish were nodding in amazement at his flawless pronunciation and grammar. Or perhaps French would be more appropriate for this distinguished gathering, David said, switching again. L'excellence académique n'est pas héritée. Elle n'est peut être acquitté. Elle n'est peut être simulée improntio uvoli. LSE gagni par le devalment, le sacrifice et un engagement sans fin envers la vérité. Dr. Ross was frantically writing notes, trying to capture every word. Other professors were recording on their phones. Sterling looked like he was going to be sick. The man who had questioned David's education was watching a display of intellectual brilliance that he could never hope to match. But why limit ourselves to these languages? David continued, his confidence growing with each word. Let me share this message in Portuguese. The switch was seamless, his tones perfect. A excelência acadêmica neo, a herdada. Ela neo pode ser comprada. Neo pode ser falsificada, emprestada ou roubada. A conquistada por meio de dedicação, sacrifício e compromisso inabalável como verdade. A Portuguese graduate student in the audience actually applauded, amazed at David's perfect pronunciation. Of course, we shouldn't forget Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance, the land that gave us perspective in art, groundbreaking discoveries in science, and innovations that shaped the modern world. David said, switching again with effortless grace. L'excellenza academica non assai reddita, non può essere comprata, non può essere falsificata, praise and prestito o rubata. Si conquista attraverso dedizione, sacrificio e un impegno incessant per la verità. The room was in complete awe. People were whispering to each other, trying to process what they were witnessing. And let me finish with Swahili. David said, the language of my ancestors, the language of a continent that gave birth to human civilization itself. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. Yubora wa kitaluma horithui. Hawizi kunanua. Hawizi kujijiza. Kwazimwa o kwibua. Unapatikana kapisha kujitolia. Dabu na yujitoji yujio nakakomo kwa ukulai. The applause was thunderous. People were standing up, cheering, amazed at what they just witnessed. Dr. David Washington had just delivered the same profound message in 7 different languages, each pronunciation perfect, each grammar flawless. But he wasn't done with Sterling yet. Now, Mr. Sterling, David said, his voice cutting through the applause. Since you're so concerned about standards and intellectual capacity, perhaps you could respond to my speech in any of those languages? Sterling's mouth moved, but no sound came out. No? How about just Spanish? Surely a Harvard graduate can manage some basic Spanish. Sterling remained silent, his face red with embarrassment. French? German? Even just a few words. Nothing. I see. David nodded. So the man who questioned my education can't speak a single foreign language. Interesting. David turned back to the crowd. But let me share some more interesting facts about Mr. Sterling's current situation. Sterling's eyes went wide with terror. He thought the worst was over. He was wrong. You see, while Mr. Sterling was busy questioning my qualifications tonight, I was curious about his current business ventures. So I did a little research during dinner. David pulled out his phone. Amazing what you can find on the internet these days. Public records, court filings, tax liens. Sterling started pushing through the crowd, tried to reach the exit, but people blocked his way, too fascinated by the ongoing drama to let him escape. It turns out Mr. Sterling has been quite busy since losing his family's company, David continued. He started 7 different businesses in the past 20 years. Would you like to know how they turned out? The crowd leaned in eagerly. Sterling Consulting. Closed after 2 years due to lack of clients. Sterling Real Estate Development. Bankruptcy. Sterling Investment Partners. SEC investigation for fraud. Sterling Technology Solutions. Lawsuit from investors. Sterling Import-Export. Tax evasion charges. Sterling Energy Services. Environmental violations. And his latest venture, Sterling Educational Consulting. David paused for dramatic effect. The company that's supposed to help students get into elite universities. The same company that's currently being investigated by the FBI for bribery and fraud in the college admissions scandal. The room erupted in shocked whispers. This was front-page news material. So let me get this straight, David said, walking closer to where Sterling was trapped by the crowd. The man who questioned my intellectual capacity has failed at every single business he's ever tried. The man who suggested I wasn't qualified to speak at Harvard is currently under federal investigation for educational fraud. Sterling was now visibly shaking, his face pale and sweaty. But wait, there's more, David said, his voice taking on the tone of a television commercial. Mr. Sterling's current net worth, according to his own financial disclosures filed in federal court last month, is negative $2.3 million. Gasps filled the room. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The man who inherited $200 million, the man who questioned my qualifications, the man who suggested I didn't belong in this room, is actually bankrupt. Again. David looked around the room with satisfaction. Meanwhile, the professor he insulted tonight has a net worth of $1.2 million, earned entirely through his own work, research, and teaching. The contrast was devastating. The room was buzzing with conversation. People sharing shocked looks, reporters frantically taking notes. So I have just one question for everyone here tonight, David said, his voice rising to fill the room. Who exactly doesn't belong in this room? The successful professor who earned everything he has? Or the failed businessman who inherited everything and lost it all? The crowd is about to deliver their verdict, but Dr. Washington has one final revelation that will end Sterling's influence at Harvard forever. The applause started like thunder in the distance and built to a roar that shook the crystal chandeliers. 200 of Harvard's most influential people were on their feet, giving Dr. David Washington a standing ovation that lasted 3 full minutes. Richard Sterling stood frozen against the back wall, his face the color of old paper, watching his world collapse in real time. "Thank you," David said into the microphone, his voice calm despite the triumph in his eyes. "But I'm not quite finished." The crowd settled back into their seats, eager to hear what else this remarkable professor had to say. You see, ladies and gentlemen, tonight has been about more than just one man's ignorance and prejudice. Tonight has been about something much bigger, something that affects every university, every workplace, every institution in America. David walked away from the podium, moving closer to the audience, making this personal and intimate. How many of you have witnessed moments like this before? How many times have you seen someone's intelligence questioned because of their race, their background, their accent, or their appearance? Heads were nodding throughout the room. Professors, administrators, even some donors were acknowledging the truth of his words. And how many times have you stayed silent? How many times have you let it slide because it was easier than confronting it? The room was quiet now, people examining their own consciences. I don't blame you. I understand the pressure. I understand the politics. I understand that speaking up can be dangerous for your career, your funding, your future. David's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But tonight, we've all seen what happens when ignorance is allowed to thrive, when prejudice goes unchallenged, when we let people like Mr. Sterling define standards and excellence. He gestured towards Sterling, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. This man inherited everything he has and lost it all through his own failures. Yet he felt entitled to question the qualifications of a professor who earned everything through hard work and talent. Why? Because he's been taught his whole life that his skin color and his family name make him superior. The truth of those words hit the room like a physical force. But here's what Mr. Sterling never learned, what people like him never understand. Intelligence is inherited. Wisdom isn't purchased. Character isn't defined by your bank account or your family tree. David looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. True excellence comes from dedication, from sacrifice, from the willingness to work harder than anyone else, to study longer, to push through obstacles that would stop other people. The crowd was hanging on every word. I didn't speak 7 languages tonight to show off. I spoke 7 languages to make a point. Every single one of those languages represents years of study, thousands of hours of practice, countless moments of frustration and failure before success. He smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a genuinely warm smile. My mother, Rosa Washington, never got to finish high school, but she taught me something more valuable than any degree. She taught me that your background doesn't determine your future. Your work does. The applause started again, but David held up his hand. I'm not finished with Mr. Sterling yet. Sterling's head snapped up in terror. He thought his humiliation was complete. You see, there's one more thing I discovered in my research tonight. Something that I think everyone in this room should know. David pulled out his phone again. Mr. Sterling, you mentioned standards earlier. You seem very concerned about Harvard's reputation and the quality of people associated with this institution. Sterling was backing toward the exit again, but the crowd was too thick. So, I think you'll be interested to know that Harvard's Board of Trustees is meeting next week to discuss your continued involvement with the university. Sterling's face went white. What are you talking about? Well, it seems that several board members have been receiving some very interesting information about your recent business activities. Information about fraud investigations, tax problems, and bankruptcy filings. David's smile was predatory now. Amazing how fast news travels in academic circles, especially when it involves major donors who might be using their influence inappropriately. He looked around the room. It turns out that several people have been concerned about your behavior for quite some time. Tonight just gave them the final push they needed. Dr. Ross stepped forward from the crowd. David is absolutely right. The board has been discussing Mr. Sterling's conduct for months. His treatment of faculty, his inappropriate comments, his attempts to influence hiring decisions. Sarah Mitchell, the department head who had introduced David to Sterling, cleared her throat. I've also been documenting incidents for the past year. Tonight's behavior was just the most public example. Other voices began speaking up from around the room. Faculty members, administrators. Even some donors started sharing their own stories of Sterling's inappropriate behavior. Sterling was surrounded now, trapped by a growing chorus of people who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. No, Sterling said desperately. This isn't right. You can't do this to me. My family built this place. David's voice cut through the chaos. Your family built this place, Mr. Sterling. You spent the last 40 years trying to tear it down. He turned to address the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Harvard University for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight, for trusting me with this platform to speak not just about my research, but about the values that make this institution truly great. David paused, looking around the room one final time. Harvard's greatness doesn't come from its buildings or its endowments. It doesn't come from the famous names carved in stone or the prestigious families who attended here generations ago. His voice grew softer but more powerful. Harvard's greatness comes from its commitment to excellence. Real excellence. The kind that's earned through merit, demonstrated through achievement, and proven through character. He gestured toward the audience. Look around this room. Look at the brilliant minds gathered here tonight. Professors who've dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Students who will go on to cure diseases, solve world hunger, and explore the stars. David's smile returned, genuine and warm. That's Harvard's true legacy. Not the Richard Sterlings of the world, but the Rosa Washingtons. The people who refuse to let circumstances define their limits. The room erupted in applause again, but this time David didn't stop it. He let it wash over him. Let it acknowledge not just his victory, but the victory of merit over privilege, of hard work over entitlement. When applause finally died down, David looked directly at Sterling one last time. Mr. Sterling, I hope someday you'll understand that intelligence isn't threatened by intelligence. That excellence isn't diminished when others achieve it too. That Harvard is big enough, great enough, to celebrate brilliance wherever it comes from. Sterling said nothing. There was nothing left to say. David walked back to the podium and picked up his notes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight. The research I presented represents 5 years of work that will hopefully contribute to our understanding of renewable energy systems. But the real research project happened right here in this room. He looked out at the crowd one final time. We studied what happens when prejudice meets preparation, when ignorance confronts intelligence, when the past tries to hold back the future. David smiled. I think we all learned something tonight about which side wins. As he walked off the stage, the standing ovation followed him. Faculty members reached out to shake his hand. Students asked for photos, and donors approached with funding offers. Richard Sterling slipped out the back door, alone and forgotten. His 40 years of unearned influence finally an end. Dr. David Washington had won more than an argument that night. He had won a battle for the soul of excellence itself. If you enjoyed this story of triumph over prejudice and the power of true excellence, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment resonated most with you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Don't forget to hit that like button if the story moved you. Subscribe for more inspiring tales of underdogs overcoming the odds, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for being part of this amazing community. Your support means everything.